Chapter 8. Dre. What is a Pac-Man? Dre's entire being was permeated with exhaustion by the time he finally pulled the cart beside his parents' shop after the day's last delivery. It wasn't the simple exhaustion of a hard day's labor. Dre could only wish for such a familiar fatigue. No, it was an exhaustion born out of a conglomeration of burdens. It was formed, in part, from his physical labors, but that was only a small portion. A larger contributor was his complete lack of sleep the previous night. Greater still was his inability to keep down food through his anxiety-induced nausea. Mostly, though, it was due to the mental strain of trying and failing to force his mind not to dwell on the catastrophic mistake he had made during his class selection. What kind of a fool traded caravans, plural, for one large pack? The Pac-Man was smiling and the others were frowning. How could I have picked anything else? Dre mocked himself quietly. Maybe you just picked the class that you know to be good, that you know will let you provide for your future family. Maybe you don't gamble your entire life on a creator-forsaken smile. Of course, the smile had just been an excuse to pick the class that he really wanted. Dre knew that. The moment he had noticed that one of the classes was associated with adventuring, he had been drawn to it, like a child to a hot stove. He was nothing but a boy trapped in a man's body. That was the only explanation. He had never actually grown up, and now he was paying the price. He was a simpleton, an idiot, a moron. He was so unbelievably stupid. No. He had berated himself all day. Every time he let his thoughts wander for even a heartbeat, he ended up castigating himself. Which made perfect sense. He well deserved it. But it wasn't helping matters in the slightest. Maybe he shouldn't worry about what helped or hurt him. Wasn't he a lost cause at this point? Maybe he should just wallow in his misery. Maybe he should just up and leave. At least then, he would no longer be a burden on those he loved. Hey, Dre, what are you thinking about? You've been standing there for a while. A hesitant voice broke through his internal dialogue. Dre turned around and saw Asya standing there. Asya, who was his best friend, the person he trusted most in the whole world. Asya, who had followed him the entire day, babysitting him, making sure he didn't throw a tantrum. Asya, who couldn't for the life of her mind her own business for one damn moment. I was thinking, Asya. What in damnation did you think I was doing? Oh, wait. You weren't thinking, were you? Maybe if you actually thought every once in a while instead of being dragged around by your emotions, you wouldn't be so startled every time that you see someone else doing it. Dre spat, with all the vitriol that he could muster. Asya's eyes got big, and tears started to well in them. Even so, her response was fierce. Well, I'm sorry for caring. Maybe if you actually let yourself feel instead of overthinking every aspect of your life, then you would know how to respond when someone is trying to be helpful and kind and loving towards you. That doesn't even make sense, Asya. Well, that shouldn't surprise you, as you already made it perfectly clear how stupid you think I am. I never said you were stupid. Is there a better description of a stupid person than someone who can't think? Dre's face was red, and his heart was pounding. He was enraged, and all he wanted to do was lash out. All he could do was lash out. Maybe in this state, he could actually do what he feared to do, what he needed to do. Maybe he could actually do what it would take, and finally set her free. You know what? You're right. You are stupid. Did you ever stop and think to yourself why I've been ignoring all of your advances? Why I was being so thick-headed? Of course you didn't, since you never think. You just felt sad that I wasn't understanding you. Dre's eyes blazed, but the look on Asya's face doused the flames of his fury. She burst into tears and screamed at him. Well, maybe it takes someone who can't think to love a heartless coward like you. She ran then, and Dre didn't follow. He couldn't follow, and he hated himself for it. He heard a sob from behind him and saw his parents standing in the doorway. His mother cried, confusion and sadness fighting for control of her expression. His father's feelings were less complicated. He was just disappointed. Dre laughed quietly to himself. Not like that is anything new, he whispered. He walked past them, into the house adjacent to the shop. He ignored the alluring smells coming from the kitchen and headed directly into his room. He was sweaty and disgusting, but he didn't care. He flopped onto the bed without taking any of his clothes off. He grabbed a pillow, pulled it tightly against his face, and screamed. He screamed and screamed until he couldn't scream anymore. Then, after what felt like an eternity, his exhaustion overtook him. Dre opened his eyes, and to his surprise, he was once again not in his bedroom. However, this time, he found himself in a much more mundane setting. He was surrounded with empty wooden shelves that had smooth tops and bottoms, but living edges, with the bark still attached. They were on 3 of the 4 walls, and there were freestanding shelves forming rows throughout the center of what appeared to be a newly constructed but empty storage room. Dre walked around the room and attempted to understand what was going on. This must be his sleep state. He had heard that some classes had these, and in fact everyone besides the common laborers seemed to have one, although bringing them up in discussion had always been confusing. The few people who seemed to fully remember their sleep state always refused to give details. Everyone else was more than willing to talk about their sleep state at first, but any relevant details always escaped their minds the moment they tried to answer his questions. It was like a dream that seems fully remembered until it falls apart in the retelling. The line of thought led Dre to some introspection. He still remembered everything that had happened before he had fallen asleep. It just didn't seem very important. His thoughts and feelings relating to the outside world were dulled. On the other hand, what he was experiencing in the present felt essential. It was like this place was forcing him to focus on the contents of the room instead of anything else. Dre made his way to the one wall that didn't have shelves running along it. It appeared to be made of one solid piece of rich golden wood, which implied that the tree it had been hewn from would have been impossibly large. Of course, his thought on possible and impossible were most likely irrelevant in this odd place that was obviously created by his useless class. On the top left edge of the wall, there was a large word burned into the wood. It read, Pac-Man, Level 1. Directly below it, in smaller text, were the words, Bearing the load so that others don't have to. Dre sighed. The class just kept getting better and better. Beneath the blackened words were 2 sets of 2 words stacked on top of each other, with one positioned slightly above his head and the other near his waist. Unlike his class name and motto, these words appeared to be formed of burning embers, like the ones found at the bottom of a campfire. But something wasn't right. They weren't burning into the wall. Dre took a step closer. He couldn't help it. He was drawn towards the flickering text like a moth to mage light. The top words read, Pac-Man Physique, and the bottom, Pac-Man Pack. He stared at them uncomprehendingly for a long moment before realization dawned on him. They were skills that came with his class. No, that didn't make sense. They were potential skills. They weren't burned into the wood permanently. He would have to choose. Part of him was annoyed that once again his information was so limited, but another, more reasonable part of himself was grateful. Not all classes gave choices. In fact, based on what Dre had heard, most didn't. Most classes assigned skills randomly, or at least without an easily definable pattern. So having a choice might mean that his class wasn't quite as bad as he had feared. Or, perhaps the more likely scenario, was that it would allow him to make the wrong choice once again. He eyed his 2 options warily. They both seemed relatively straightforward. Pac-Man Physique was obviously some sort of body enhancement skill, which was quite tempting. Adding some muscle onto his already large frame seemed like a good thing. However, the other option, Pac-Man Pack, seemed even more obvious. The pack had to be the ludicrously large thing the Pac-Man body had been wearing during his class selection vision. Although, honestly, it seemed underwhelming at best and inconvenient at worst, unless it had special properties that he was unaware of. The question was whether this was a both and or an either-or scenario. In the former situation, this choice was less significant. He could choose one, then the other. But if it was the latter, then the decision became much more difficult. Pac-Man Physique seemed better to him, but could he really pass up on the skill that was the namesake of the class? Even if the thing's size made it impractical in the extreme? No. He had to choose Pac-Man Pack. If he missed out on the one skill that might make his subpar class useful, then he would never forgive himself. All he could hope for was that the pack had some sort of enchantment that would make it better than it seemed. On instinct, he approached the wall. He hesitantly reached towards the embers that spelled out Pac-Man Pack, afraid of getting burned. But as his hand inched closer, there was no heat. Even when he pressed it into the word, it didn't hurt. Instead, the glowing embers vanished, replaced by a blackened, smooth indentation where the word was now burned into the wall. He glanced around, looking for the aforementioned pack, but all of the shelves surrounding him remained empty. He shrugged. It must only appear outside of his sleep state. He took a few steps back as he returned his attention to the wall and breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that the embers spelling out Pac-Man physique remained. Besides that, there were now 5 curving lines of embers that branched out from Pac-Man pack towards 5 new potential skills that formed a column to the right of the original skill. Inventory, reduced weight, reduced size, increased capacity, and increased durability. Dre's head spun with questions and possibilities as he looked over the potential skills. Inventory must have something to do with keeping track of what was in his pack. Useful, but not all that exciting. Reduced weight seemed self-explanatory, and was an absolute must in Dre's estimation. He had heard of bags that made what they contained way less, but with their astronomical prices he had never imagined owning one himself. Reduced size was also pretty clear, and practical with how obnoxiously large the pack was, but wouldn't that reduce how much he was able to carry? Wasn't carrying a lot of stuff the whole point of the class? Increased capacity seemed simple at first, but the more he thought about it, the less sense it made. Wouldn't increasing the capacity increase the size? If the size increased, would he even be able to fit it through doors? Wouldn't reduced size and increased capacity just cancel each other out? Increased durability was less confusing, but of limited use in the short run. Although long-term, having the pack take less damage seemed like a good thing. His excitement for the new skills varied dramatically, but he didn't even consider taking any of them next. There was only one logical choice. So he once again walked up to the wall and, this time in a quick, confident motion, reached out and touched the glowing embers of Pac-Man physique. He was thus horrified when he realized that this time the embers were actually hot. He quickly pulled his hand back, but too late. Fire ignited on his hand, raced up his arm, and within moments he was entirely engulfed in searing pain.